Alright, welcome back to Mr. Berry Lectures. This is Chapter 15, Section 4, Aggressors Invade Nations. Originally given on the 5th of May, it is now the 8th, so we're getting this in just before your review and test. So, main idea for today's notes: power and authority. And as Germany, Italy, and Japan conquered other countries, the rest of the world did nothing to stop them. By the mid-1930s, Germany and Italy seemed bent on military conquest, along with Japan. And we're going to look at why it matters here. Now, many nations today take a more active role in world affairs than the United Nations because we kind of want to stop some of these situations that occurred at this time with Japan, Italy, and Germany. And because we were trying to do something that we'll look at later called appeasement, this has kind of exacerbated the situation. So we try to kind of nib these things in the bud before it ever becomes an issue. Now, setting the stage. Like I said, by the mid-1930s, Germany and Italy seemed bent on military conquest. The major democracies, Britain, France, and the United States, were, of course, distracted by the economic problems at home and no longer wanted to remain involved with these other nations. They in fact wanted to remain at peace. With the world moving toward war, many nations pinned their hopes for peace on the League of Nations. As fascism spread in Europe, however, a powerful nation in Asia moved toward a similar system. Following a period of reform and progress in the 1920s, Japan will follow under a military rule. Japan seeks an empire. During the 1920s, the Japanese government had become more democratic. They had just left a period of time called the Meiji era, which had brought them to great westernization, and with their new emperor, Emperor Hirohito, they had entered a truly democratic period. In 1922, Japan signed an international treaty agreeing to respect China's borders. In 1928, it signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, renouncing war. Japan's parliamentary system had several weaknesses, however, and in its constitution it actually put strict limits on the powers of the prime minister and the cabinet. Most importantly, civilian leaders had little to no control over the armed forces. Military leaders actually only reported to the emperor. Now this is probably not going to go well. Militarists take over Japan. As long as Japan remained prosperous, the civilian government kept power. But when the Great Depression struck in 1922, many Japanese blamed the government. Military leaders gained support and soon won control of the country. Unlike the fascists in Europe, the militarists did not try to establish a new system of government. They instead wanted to restore traditional control of the government to the military, and instead of a forceful leader like Mussolini or Hitler, the militarists made the emperor the symbol of state power. Keeping Emperor Hirohito as head of state won popular support for the army leaders who ruled in his name. In fact, that means that he is not really in control. In fact, the military is. Like Hitler and Mussolini, Japan's militarists were extreme nationalists. They wanted to solve the country's economic problems through foreign expansion. They planned, in fact, a Pacific Empire that would include a conquered China, and the empire would provide Japan with raw materials and markets for its goods. It would also give Japan room for its rising population, which at that point was becoming quite large and is now rather staggeringly large at 127 million for a country that is no larger really than our state of California. So they are going to invade Manchuria. Now, Japan invades Manchuria. Japanese businesses had invested heavily in China's northeast province, Manchuria. It was an area rich in iron and coal, which are very useful if you happen to be an industrialized nation like Japan is, and in 1931 the Japanese army go ahead and seize Manchuria, despite the objections of the Japanese parliament, which did not authorize it to do so. As you'll recall, though, the parliament has no control over the army, so that doesn't matter. The army then set up a puppet government with Japanese engineers and technicians and engineers began to arrive and build in large numbers mines and factories. The Japanese attack on Manchuria was the first direct challenge to the League of Nations, and in the early 1930s, the League's members included all major democracies except the United States. The League also included the three countries that posed the greatest threat to peace: Germany, Japan, and Italy. When Japan seized Manchuria, many League members vigorously protested. As a result, Japan ignored the protests and in fact just withdrew themselves from the League in 1933. So, Japan invades China proper. 4 years later, after 1933, in 1937, a border incident touches off a full-scale war between Japan and China. Japanese forces swept into northern China. Despite having 1 million soldiers, China's army, led by Jiang Jiechi, was no match for the better equipped and trained Japanese. Beijing and other northern cities, as well as the capital, Nanjing, fell to the Japanese in 1937. Nanjing is interesting because at this point in this city, Japanese troops killed tens of thousands of captured soldiers and civilians in Nanjing. Forced to retreat westward, Jiang Jiechi set up a new capital in Chongqing. At the same time, Chinese guerrillas, led by China's Communist Party, I should mention, leader Mao Zedong, continued to fight the Japanese in the conquered area. Now, I point out Nanjing because it is a contentious issue between the Chinese and the Japanese to this day. In fact, you can see in the picture on the right, there is a Japanese soldier with several of his, I guess his conscripts behind him, sitting in front of the severed heads of many of Nanjing's residents. So there is a great deal of atrocities here, and even today the Japanese will tend to ignore or try to deny the fact that these things occurred. But just be aware that that is an issue they still deal with today. Now let's go to Europe. European aggressors on the march. Mussolini attacks Ethiopia. Now, the League's failure to stop the Japanese encouraged European fascists to plan aggression of their own. The Italian leader Mussolini, of course, dreamed of building a colonial empire in Africa like those of Britain and France. They had kind of missed out on that during the scramble for Africa in the 1800s. Ethiopia was one of Africa's 3 independent nations. The Ethiopians had successfully resisted an Italian attempt at conquest during the 1890s. If you'll recall, Menelik II helps them keep away from that. And to avenge that defeat, Mussolini ordered a massive invasion of Ethiopia in October 1935. The spears and swords of the Ethiopians, and along with their older and aging stockpile of weapons from the 1890s, were no match for Italian airplanes, tanks, guns, and poison gas, which they had gained all during the First World War. The Ethiopian Emperor, Haile Selassie, urgently appealed to the League of Nations for help. Although the League condemned the attack and sent many letters, I'm sure, its members did nothing. Britain continued to let Italian troops and supplies pass through the British-controlled Suez Canal on their way to Ethiopia. By giving in to Mussolini in Africa, Britain and France hoped to keep peace in Europe. But they were not going to, in fact, help the Ethiopians. Now, since we talked about Italy, let's talk about Hitler and Germany. Hitler defies the Versailles Treaty. Part 1. Hitler had long pledged to undo the Versailles Treaty. Among its provisions, the treaty actually limited the size of Germany's army, so it couldn't actually build up its army like maybe it wanted to. And in March 1935, shortly after Hitler came to power, the Führer, Hitler, announced that Germany would not obey these restrictions. The League issued only a mild condemnation, like they didn't like the idea, but they were going to let him do it. The League's failure to stop Germany from rearming convinced Hitler to take even greater risks. The treaty had forbidden German troops to enter a 30-mile wide zone on either side of the Rhine River. This area is known as the Rhineland. The zone formed a buffer between Germany and France. It was also an important industrial area, and on March 7, 1936, German troops moved into the Rhineland, stunned. The French were unwilling to risk war. They really just didn't want to touch off a war between them and Germany. The British at this point urged a thing that we will become rather familiar with, a policy called appeasement. giving in to an aggressor to keep peace. Now, appeasement is your vocab term here. It is the making of concessions to an aggressor in order to avoid war. And I love this comic down here on the right. It is Hitler standing and stepping up on the spineless leaders of democracy. Stepping stones to glory, it calls it. But Hitler is clearly having a good time, and no one is stopping him. Now, because the British and French did not challenge Hitler, there are going to be some problems. Hitler later actually admitted that he would have backed down if the French and British had challenged him, so it's actually kind of sad that we, as a Western nations, didn't have the backbone to stop him. The German reoccupation of the Rhineland marked a turning point in the march toward war. First, it strengthened Hitler's power and prestige in Germany. It made him even more popular than he already was. Second, the balance of power changed in Germany's favor. France and Belgium were now open to attack from German troops. Germany actually had troops there waiting to attack France and Belgium if they so chose. Finally, and thirdly, the weak response by France and Britain encouraged Hitler to speed up his expansion because obviously they aren't going to stop him. Hitler's growing strength convinced Mussolini that he should seek an alliance with Germany. In October of 1936, the two dictators actually reached an agreement that became known as the Rome-Berlin Axis. A month later, Germany also made an agreement with Japan, and Germany, Italy, and Japan came to be called the Axis powers. The Axis powers is one of your vocab terms here. It is, in World War II, the nations of Germany, Italy, and Japan, which had formed this alliance in 1936. Now, we will go briefly to talk about Spain. Hitler and Mussolini again tested the will of the democracies of Europe in the Spanish Civil War. Spain had been a monarchy until 1931, when a republic was declared there. The government, run by liberals and socialists, held office amidst many crises and generally didn't govern particularly well. So in July 1936, army leaders favoring a fascist-style government joined General Francisco Franco in a revolt. Thus began a civil war that dragged on for 3 years. Hitler and Mussolini sent troops, tanks, and airplanes to help Franco's forces, which were called the Nationalists. The armed forces of the Republicans, as supporters of Spain's elected government, as they were known, received little help from abroad. The Western democracies remained neutral. They did not help. Only the Soviet Union really sent much equipment or advisors, but even that was really not sufficient. An international brigade of volunteers fought on the Republican side, but again did not prevent the fascists from taking over, and early in 1939, Republican resistance collapsed. Franco, in fact, became Spain's fascist dictator. Now, Francisco Franco is one of your vocab terms. It is there, up top right. He is the fascist dictator of Spain from 1939 to 1975, which is actually a rather long time, considering the plight or fate of the Italian and German dictators of the period. But he is helped into power by both of them, Mussolini and Hitler. Now, since social studies is kind of a social science, we want to look at things from a bunch of different perspectives. I want to show you guys a piece of art here as part of your notes. This, which you can see in the slide here, is actually Guernica by Pablo Picasso. This is a 1937 piece of art. Now, on April 27, 1937, Franco's German allies bombed an ancient Basque city of Guernica in Spain. The city was reduced to rubble by the bombing. However, Spanish artist Pablo Picasso's painting, which we can see here again, called Guernica, captures the human horror of the event. Using geometric forms of cubism, Picasso shows a city and people that have been torn into pieces. Unnatural angles, overlapping images of people, severed limbs, and animals in clear fear for their lives reflect the suffering and chaos caused by the attack. At left, a mother cries over her dead child. In the center, a horse screams, and a soldier lies dead with a broken sword. At right, a woman falls from a burning house, and people are generally in a sad state of affairs. This brings a lot of attention to the Spanish Civil War, and if you've never seen this art, or if you have before, maybe now you have a greater appreciation for its meaning. In fact, this piece of art actually used to hang at the UN, I believe, and now as in a Spanish museum of its own. It is an incredibly large piece of art, by the way. So the way that you see it on YouTube, or you saw it in class, it is much larger than the projector that I could show you on there. It is actually a wall-sized mural, so it was not a small piece of art, and it did make a great impression on a lot of people. Again, bringing national or international prominence to the situation in Spain. Art is kind of interesting that way, in that even if you don't speak Spanish, even if you haven't experienced a situation, it can often bring to life a lot of the pain and suffering and situations of the world, even if you don't speak the language of the people who are experiencing it. Alright, let us go to see how democratic nations will try to preserve peace in this period. Instead of taking a stand against fascist aggression in the 1930s, Britain and France basically repeatedly make concessions to both of these countries, Italy and Germany, hoping to keep peace. Both nations were dealing with serious economic problems. Both Britain and France were dealing with economic problems as a result of the Great Depression. And in addition, the horrors of World War I had created kind of a deep desire to avoid war. America also was scarred by these horrors of World War I, and they began to follow a policy of isolationism. Many Americans supported this idea of isolationism. Basically, it's the belief that political ties to other countries should be avoided. Isolationists basically argued that entry into World War I had been a costly error, and that beginning in 1935, actually during this period, you have Congress passing 3 neutrality acts. These laws banned loans and sale of arms to nations at war. This was not, again, a war that the United States wanted to be involved in. Isolationism is one of your vocab terms. It is a policy, again, of avoiding political or military involvement with other countries or nations. Let's look again, then, at some expansion of the German Reich. In November of 1937, on November 5th, actually, Hitler announced to his advisors his plan to absorb Austria and Czechoslovakia into the Third Reich, or the German Empire. The Treaty of Versailles prohibited what is called an Anschluss, or a union between Austria and Germany. However, many Austrians supported unity with Germany, so they were actually mostly okay with this, at least as far as being taken over. In March of 1938, Hitler sent his army into Austria and annexed it. There was basically no blood to speak of here. France and Britain ignored their pledge to protect Austrian independence and allowed this to occur. Hitler next turned to Czechoslovakia. About 3 million German-speaking people, lived in the western regions of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. This heavily fortified area formed the Czechs' main defense against Germany. The Anschluss between Germany and Austria raised pro-Nazi feelings among the Sudeten Germans, and in September 1938, Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland be given to Germany. The Czechs, of course, refused and asked France for help. Before we go on with this, I want to mention again the Third Reich is one of your vocab terms. It is the Third German Empire established by Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. So like I said, the Czechs really don't want to give up their area called the Sudetenland, okay? They ask for France and Britain to help, and unfortunately, as we've kind of seen in this section of notes, France and Britain are not really in the habit of helping anyone during this period. France and Britain were, however, going to begin preparing for war in 1938, and this is only stopped because of a meeting proposed by Mussolini. He proposes a meeting of Germany, France, Britain, and Italy in Munich, Germany. The so-called and appropriately named Munich Conference was held on September 29, 1938. The Czechs were not invited, interestingly, even though a lot of what they were going to be discussing was about them. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that he could preserve peace by giving in to Hitler's demand of the Sudetenland coming into Germany. Britain and France agreed that Hitler could take the Sudetenland. In exchange, however, Hitler pledged to respect Czechoslovakia's new borders. When Chamberlain returned to London after the conference, he actually told cheering crowds, quote, "I believe it is peace for our time." Winston Churchill, who would later become the Prime Minister during the Second World War, and who was then a member of the British Parliament, strongly disagreed. He opposed the appeasement policy and gloomily warned of its consequences, saying, in a speech before the House of Commons in October of that year, he says, "We are in the presence of a disaster of the first magnitude. We have sustained a defeat without a war. And do not suppose that this is the end. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be preferred to us year by year, unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor we arise again and take our stand for freedom as in the olden time." It turns out that Churchill, as he often was very correct about this policy of appeasement. Less than 6 months after the Munich meeting, Hitler, in fact, took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Soon afterwards, Mussolini seized Albania. Then Hitler demanded that Poland return former German port of Danzig. The Poles refused, of course, and turned to Britain and France for aid. But appeasement had convinced Hitler that neither nation would risk war. However, in this particular regard, he was incorrect, and the invasion of Poland will actually be what sparks the Second World War. Before we go to the next slide, I want to point out, of course, that you're probably aware, but the Munich Conference, this agreement, this conference where they made the agreement to give away the Sudetenland, is one of your vocab terms. It is a 1938 meeting of representatives from Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, at which the British and the French agreed to allow Nazi Germany to annex part of Czechoslovakia, called the Sudetenland, in return for Hitler's pledge to respect the new Czech borders. And by God, that is a long definition, but I apologize, and that's exactly the way it comes out of your book, so sorry about that. One last slide here. So, Nazi and Soviets sign a non-aggression pact. Britain and France had asked the Soviet Union to join them in stopping Hitler's aggression, and as Stalin talked with Britain and France, he also bargained with Hitler. Usually generally a bad plan, but the two dictators did reach an agreement. Once bitter enemies in World War I, Fascist Germany and Communist Russia now publicly pledged never to attack one another. On August 23, 1939, their leaders signed what is now called a non-aggression pact. As the Axis powers moved unchecked at the end of the decade, war appears inevitable, which we will see in Chapter 16. That's the end of the chapter. Study well for your test, which is on Monday. Good luck.